not just because of the good work that you do every day, but because I can relate. Because, as Bill mentioned, I, too, was a community organizer. And I think that community organizers generally look at the world a little bit differently. We see abandoned buildings on forgotten corners not as a problem, but as a possibility. Maybe to build a new facility for homeless veterans. We walk by a community center and we think, that might be a good place for people to gather and talk about how we can improve our school system. We walk into a basement of a church and we think, this is a place where we could start changing the world. So I know what it's like to be on the phone trying to get people to come to a meeting. I know what it's like to ride around in a car that you're not sure is going to get to the next event. I know what it's like traveling from meeting to meeting in the middle of winter and never quite thaw out. I know what it means to believe deeply that every single day we can work hard to change the world as it is, to maybe a little bit more to the way that the world should be. Now, thanks to your efforts, there is Election Day registration in Iowa. Something I might add that we could use all across the country. Yeah. Thanks to your organizing, people know that our budget has to reflect our values. And when we give tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans, to people who don't need them and weren't even asking for them, on the back of child care or job training or housing for the poor, there's something disorganized about the values of Washington. Thanks to your commitment for change, progressives all across Iowa know what our common values are. So, a long time I learned this kind of change starts in places like this, in small meeting rooms, in cities all across the country. It always starts from the bottom up and not from the top down. I got my start, as Bill mentioned, on the south side of Chicago. I'm not a Chicago native, but a group of churches had organized themselves to try to figure out what could be done to reverse the steady decline that had taken place as steel plants closed throughout the region. Tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs. Homes have been foreclosed, commercial strips began to deteriorate. And so these churches got together, didn't have much money, but had a lot of passion and a lot of concern and a belief that their gospel demanded not just that they pray, but also that they act. And I, at the time, had just graduated from Columbia University and had been active with some community activism on campus. And I had been inspired by the civil rights movement. I was too young to participate myself, but I had been struck by the stories and the images of young people from all across the country loading up on buses, taking those freedom rides to make sure that people got the right to vote. I was inspired by those young people sitting straight-backed, clear-eyed, as people hurled epithets at them and poured milk on them while they were sitting at lunch counters because they were sitting down for their dignity. And I thought to myself, that's something that I want to be a part of. That's something that I want to aspire to. And so those two forces, the churches and my interest in doing something from the bottom up, joined because they didn't have a lot of money and all they could afford to hire was me. And so I remember I was paid the grand sum of, it was $12,000 or $13,000 a year, plus car expenses. And I drove out to Chicago, didn't know a single person. And over the next 3 years, I worked with lay people in these churches and unions and block clubs and progressive organizations around the city to try to move things in a better direction. I still remember the first meeting that I organized. We were in a church basement, and I had gone and canvassed the whole community to find out what people's concerns were, and the biggest concern was that drug dealing was starting to take place in these neighborhoods that previously had been quiet. And drug houses were starting to come up, and it didn't seem like the police were handling it appropriately, that there was enough effort in terms of maintaining public safety. And the way I was taught to organize, you always wanted to start with people's self-interest. So when I heard people repeatedly saying that people were concerned about public safety, I came back to these churches and I said, you know, we've got to organize a meeting with a police commander in the area and hold police accountable for a plan to deal with the scourge of drugs throughout the community. And so I passed out thousands of leaflets all across the area, and we called the police commander. One of his assistants said he'd come. I was very excited. The night of the meeting comes, we've got all these chairs laid out, and time of the meeting, I think one person's shown up. And then about 10 minutes pass, about 3 people have shown up. And then suddenly, finally, 15 minutes later, this big crowd of people come in, maybe 20, 25 people, and I'm ecstatic. I'm feeling a little relieved. I noticed they're all a little bit older, and they settle into their chairs. I go over to thank them so much for coming, and they said, "When's bingo starting?" And needless to say, when they heard that that night was not bingo night, they all got up and left. The police commander didn't show up, and I was miserable and discouraged. And I remember having a conversation with an older gentleman during back in these days, and him saying, you know what, you should go into organizing. You've got a nice voice, you present yourself well, you should go into television. That's where the real future is. And I thought about it a little bit. I thought, why am I trying to change the world here, getting paid no money, and nobody's appreciating it. But I remember after that meeting, looking out and seeing a group of young people, children, 12, 13 years old. They were out in the middle of the night, unsupervised. They were throwing rocks at a building. And I thought about what was their future going to be like? Who was looking after them? And my leadership in that organization, we got discouraged about the possibilities of ever making any progress. I asked them, I said, you know what, if we don't stand up for those children, who will? If we're not organizing on their behalf and giving them a voice, who will? We have an obligation to keep trying. And that's what we did. And over the next 3.5 years, slowly, incrementally, sometimes painfully, we were able to pull together an organization of over 20 churches. We raised a budget, and we started job training programs for the unemployed, after-school programs for youth, and brought city services to communities that hadn't had them before. And I always tell people it was the best education that I ever had, better than anything I got at Harvard Law School, because what it taught me was that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're given a chance. When they're given some tools to shape their own collective destiny, then good things happen. And it's that education that was seared into my brain. And it didn't leave, law school sometimes will make you a little crazy, but it didn't leave after law school. And as Bill said, when I came back, when I got out of law school, I knew that I would be committed to continuing to work at a grassroots level. Because I knew that if I was ever going to make change in the world, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't me dictating change from on high, but rather because I was listening to people and being responsive and working with them. Now, that, I think, is the essence of what all of you experience each and every day. The fact is that making your mark on the world is hard. It's not easy. If it was easy, everybody would do it. It takes patience, it takes commitment, and it comes with plenty of failure along the way. The real test is not whether you avoid this failure, because you won't. It's whether you let it harden, or shame you into inaction, or whether instead you learn from it